Kia ora. It's my great pleasure to be here to provide a scientific reality check on the state of the global climate, an update on how we are tracking to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, and what a failure of climate policy means for our region. So first, a brief overview of the current state of the global climate. 2023 was the world's warmest year on record. Extraordinary heat was observed over land and in the global oceans. And as you can see from this figure, the warming trend is relentless and still shows no sign of slowing down. These 5 global datasets used to monitor global temperatures show that the Earth's average temperature was 1.45 degrees above pre-industrial levels in 2023. So you can think of the conditions experienced last year as essentially a preview of what average background climate will be like by the time 1.5 degrees of warming is consistently achieved, most likely in the early 2030s. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, our 6th assessment report, concluded that virtually all of the warming experienced since 1850 is attributed to human activities. So that's the burning of fossil fuels and the clearing and degradation of land. And warming will continue until the burning of fossil fuels stops, carbon-absorbing ecosystems are restored, and excess carbon is removed from the atmosphere using carbon removal technology. And while most people know that greenhouse gases trap extra heat in the Earth's atmosphere, not all of us are aware of the vast majority of heat, some 93%, is actually absorbed by the oceans. And record heat has been observed in the global ocean every single month between April 2023 and June 2024. And as expected, extreme heat has had disastrous impacts on marine ecosystems around the world. In April this year, the world's 4th mass coral bleaching event on record was declared, and the impacts in the Pacific region have been catastrophic. 80% of the Great Barrier Reef, so the world's largest coral reef ecosystem, has been bleached, with damage extending throughout its entire range for the first time. The figure on the right shows the damage mapped by the Australian Institute for Marine Science. Those yellow, orange and red colours indicate bleaching of some kind. And just for context, experts estimate that half of the Great Barrier Reef's shallow water corals actually died off in 2016-2017, and it's still unknown or undisclosed exactly how much more permanently died off during the 2020-2022 mass bleachings and now this most recent bout of extreme heat and how it will impact the reef. But scientists know that given that 2% of the Great Barrier Reef only escaped bleaching in the 2022 event, it's likely that the extensive reef-wide bleaching of this year has dealt the largest living structure on the planet its death blow. And as a reminder, the IPCC has estimated that between 70 and 90% of the world's coral reef systems will be destroyed with 1.5 degrees of global warming, with only 1% remaining once 2 degrees is reached. And I put this up to say that it's just not possible for some ecosystems to adapt to climate change, and it's dangerous to pretend that they can. We need to face the reality of the destruction global warming is now causing, not just to our natural environment, but to our societies and economies right across the Pacific. And it also makes me wonder exactly how much do we need to lose before our political leaders decide to take this seriously. I also wanted to update you on signs of abrupt climate change that are starting to emerge from Antarctica. Large areas of sea ice in Antarctica failed to form during the Southern Hemisphere winter of 2023. And in June, an area almost the size of Western Australia was found to be missing. So Antarctica has experienced a steep decline in sea ice since 2016, as you can see from this graph, and conditions experienced in 2023 were completely off the charts. And statistically speaking, the loss of sea ice was 7 standard deviations away from the long-term average, which is a phenomenal departure from normal conditions. Experts believe that we may be experiencing the beginning of an abrupt critical transition that will result in the inevitable disintegration of the West Antarctic ice sheet. And if the West Antarctic ice sheet melts, there's the potential to raise global sea level by around 4 metres. So this change is considered irreversible on timescales of tens of thousands of years. And this change is considered irreversible on timescales of tens to thousands of years. So this has really major implications for sea level rise, ocean circulation, and weather patterns all over the world. So it's fair to say that the situation is extremely serious and set to get worse as emissions still show no sign of slowing down. So political recognition of the threat of climate change began over 30 years ago following the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's first assessment report in 1990. And yet the political response has been entirely inadequate. As you can see from this graph, emissions continue to rise despite all the IPCC reports and the UN climate summits. Around half of the carbon dioxide accumulated in the atmosphere has been emitted since 1990, so the release of that very first IPCC report. Carbon emissions reached record highs last year, with humanity burning through 40.6 billion tonnes of CO2 in 2023. So we need to get real and ask ourselves, well, are the Paris Agreement targets actually within reach? And the purpose of COP28, the UN Climate Summit in Dubai last year, was to assess how the world is tracking to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement to limit warming to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And the text calls on parties to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly and equitable manner, accelerating action this critical decade so as to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. So next I'd like to look at how consistent global climate policies are in keeping with the science. But first let's go back to some basic facts about climate change. This figure is showing a breakdown of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see, carbon dioxide shown in black is the largest contributor, with methane shown in grey as the next largest contributor. So while methane or natural gas is being talked about as a low emissions transition fuel, make no mistake, it's still a very powerful greenhouse gas. And although methane breaks down more quickly in the atmosphere, it is still over 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide as measured over a 20-year window, meaning that the burning of gas will exacerbate global warming in the near term. The science tells us that approximately 60% of oil and gas reserves and 90% of coal must remain unextracted if warming is to be limited to 1.5 degrees. And so although some people might try and argue that black is white and white is black, scientists understand the root cause of climate change is carbon dioxide and methane released from the burning of coal, oil and gas. And until carbon capture and storage technology materialises, emissions are going to continue to rise, locking in more and more global warming for centuries to come. So the more sensible thing to do here is to actually stop generating new emissions. But the difficult reality we have to face here is that we are collectively failing to reduce global emissions. And according to the United Nations Environment Programme, in a very best case scenario where all net zero pledges are realised, we only have a 14% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, and that's likely to be breached in the early 2030s. This is a very serious reality we need to face and start preparing for, especially in the Pacific. But unfortunately, our problems don't end there. Right now, there is a 90% chance that the continuation of current climate policies will result in a 2.3 to 4.5 degrees of global warming by the end of the century, with a best estimate of 3.5. And even in a best case scenario where all net zero pledges are honoured, we are still looking at warming between 2 and 3 degrees by 2100, with a best estimate of 2.4. This represents a catastrophic overshooting of the Paris Agreement targets, highlighting just how far off track we really are. So given the scientific reality we are facing, I now want to zoom in and look at what continued global warming means for Australia and for New Zealand. And when it comes to climate change, Australia is one of the most vulnerable nations in the world. We are the flattest and driest inhabited continent on the planet, and around 3/4 of Australia is classified as arid or semi-arid, meaning that half the country receives less than 300 millimetres of rainfall every year. So we're essentially a very hot and dry nation that is delicately balanced with rainfall. And most of Australia's population and critical infrastructure like airports, roads and shipping ports are located along the coast. But despite being extremely vulnerable to climate change in the form of coastal inundation, extreme heat, rainfall extremes like droughts and floods, Australia's climate policy remains entirely inadequate given the threats that we face. And given that close to 90% of Australia's population lives near the coast, it's important to understand the risks associated with increases in sea level. because these changes not only impact us in the short term on timescales of years and decades, but once ice sheets have melted, it unlocks long-term changes that will continue to unfold hundreds to thousands of years into the future. And according to the IPCC, global sea level could rise between 1 to 2 metres by the end of this century under a fossil fuel-intensive pathway. So the figures I'm showing you here are taken from Coastal Risk Australia's mapping tool that shows the inundation risks associated with a 2-metre sea level rise at high tide for the coastal cities of Sydney on the left and Brisbane on the right. Airports in Sydney and Brisbane will largely be underwater by 2100 if the projected 2-metre sea level rise happens. And just as a rule of thumb, coastal experts estimate that for every 1 metre of sea level rise, it results in 100 metres of shoreline recession. So even under the IPCC's intermediate emissions scenario, Australia's sandy shorelines are projected to retreat around about 100 metres in eastern Australia and on the south coast by the end of this century. And under a fossil fuel intensive scenario, we could see those numbers effectively double. And as the Australian Academy of Science notes, under high levels of warming and sea level rise, retreat is likely to be the only feasible long-term strategy. So we need to start thinking about planned relocation of vulnerable low-lying populations and infrastructure and accept that adaptation will not be possible in some regions. It's possible to explore the regional impacts of different global warming scenarios using the IPCC's Interactive Atlas. And if the world's collective Paris Agreement pledges for 2030 are fully implemented intangible policies, our emissions trajectory is approximately in line with the IPCC's middle-of-the-road intermediate emissions pathway known as the SSP 2 to 4.5. And under this optimistic scenario, Australia's average temperature increases between 2.2 and 4.1 degrees by the end of the century, with a central estimate of 3.1. So that's twice the warming that Australia's already experienced. And if we consider a future of continued investment in fossil fuels represented in the IPCC's high emissions scenarios of the SSP 3 to 7, Australia warms between 3.2 and 5.6 by 2100 with a best estimate of 4.4. And just in terms of the reality of what, say, 2 degrees of global warming means, we start to see the start of 50-degree temperatures in places like Sydney and Melbourne, and 3 degrees sees this become a regular feature of the Australian summer. Such high levels of warming will render some parts of the country uninhabitable, inland areas of Queensland, Western Australia and so on. And under a high emissions scenario, Sydney takes on the subtropical climate of Brisbane, while Melbourne transitions to the aridity currently experienced in Adelaide. So we're talking about a fundamental shift in our climate that will be very difficult, if not impossible, to adapt to. And here in New Zealand, the warming isn't as pronounced as in Australia due to the nation's smaller size and the buffering capacity of the surrounding ocean. But under the IPCC's middle-of-the-road scenario, New Zealand's average land temperature increases between 1.7 and 3.3 by 2100, with a central estimate of 2.4, or more than double the warming that New Zealand's already experienced. And if we consider a high emissions scenario, New Zealand warms between 2.5 and 4.5 by 2100 with a best estimate of 3.4. So as you can see, the situation is extremely serious and we are still failing to adequately address the problem. In fact, we are continuing to do harm. And no matter how the continued burning of fossil fuels is justified, once emissions enter the atmosphere, the genie's out of the bottle. Carbon stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. So next I'd like to do a reality check on how the world is going in terms of its transitioning away from fossil fuels. And as a reminder, total global emissions are made up from the burning of fossil fuels and land use change. These are the latest figures from the Global Carbon Project that show that 82% of carbon dioxide emissions since 1960 have come from the burning of coal, oil and gas, with the remaining 18% coming from land use changes like deforestation and the degradation of ecosystems. So clearly, the reduction of fossil fuels is the urgent priority. But unfortunately, this message does not seem to be getting through. When you examine Australia's latest greenhouse gas figures, you can see that most of the reduction in Australia's emissions are currently coming from land use changes shown by the dark green line and the electricity sector shown in the light green line. The Australian government has a very long history of relying heavily on the land sector to demonstrate progress towards reducing emissions while continuing to export vast amounts of coal and gas to the rest of the world. But if you remove land use figures and just count actual emissions from polluting industries and the like, Australia's emissions have only declined by around 2.5% since 2005. And obviously this falls well short of meeting the government's legislated target of a 43% reduction in emissions by 2030. But when you include land use, the government's claim that Australia's emissions have fallen 29% since 2005 masks the negligible reductions in total emissions across all sectors. And the safeguard mechanism, which is Australia's signature climate policy, actually allows Australia's largest polluters to buy carbon credits to offset their emissions instead of actually requiring them to reduce the huge volume of carbon they are dumping into the atmosphere for free. And in the Climate Change Authority's 2023 progress report, they reported that Australia is not yet on track to meet our emissions, despite all the talk. And it's not too hard to understand why. This figure from the Global Carbon Project shows that coal, oil and gas production is still increasing globally. As Australia is the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world, what we do over the next handful of years really, really matters. And while renewable energy production is increasing, as you can see from the bottom of the graph, it's still being dwarfed by fossil fuel production. And according to the International Monetary Fund, in 2022, world governments spent around $7 trillion on fossil fuel subsidies. That's more than the amount that the UN says is needed by developing nations to adapt to climate change, as well as the finance, to actually finance the clean energy transition. And while the Australian government has made some good progress in the areas of renewable energy and supporting green manufacturing, the truth is that we're still heavily subsidising the fossil fuel industry. And just last financial year, state and federal governments provided $14.5 billion in fossil fuel subsidies. So instead of the polluter pays principle, right now Australian taxpayers are footing the bill to support the continuation of the fossil fuel industries. And what governments do to support polluting industries influences public and private investment, as you all know, undermining the transition of renewable energy by locking in fossil fuel infrastructure for decades to come. So we need policies that incentivise the decarbonisation of the economy to rapidly bring down emissions. But instead of putting a price on carbon and investing heavily in renewable energy needed to unlock the major reductions in emissions, governments around the world are still supporting fossil fuel production. And in fact, a confronting report co-authored by the United Nations Environment Programme shows that governments are planning to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than is consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And as you can see from this figure, the red line shows that coal production is projected to increase until 2030, with oil and gas production extending out to 2050. But as you can also see from this graph, the purple lines are scenarios that are consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, with the green line showing a 2-degree world. The brown dotted line represents pledges announced by governments, but they heavily rely on carbon capture and storage and other offsetting measures to get there. So this figure shows that despite all the talk, the world is still disastrously off track to stabilise global emissions by 2050. And it's easy to understand why. Countries like Australia have major coal and gas reserves, like major gas basins in the northwest and the east coast of Australia, so there is a strong temptation to continue production. Energy policy is closely tied to geopolitics, which is becoming increasingly harder to navigate in a war-torn world. But we need to take the moral, intergenerational stance on this and listen to the science and leave these reserves unexploited. And despite some good progress by the Australian government, the truth is that they are still proposing policies that will see the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. The Australian Labor Party's future gas strategy locks in fossil fuel use and infrastructure until 2050 and beyond, which is entirely incompatible with the scientific reality that we're facing. As I mentioned, methane or natural gas is still a very powerful greenhouse gas that is going to increase emissions and make the problem of climate change even worse. And it's clear that Australia's lack of genuine leadership on climate change is influencing New Zealand's energy policy and encouraging us to turn our back on our Pacific Island neighbours. Just a couple of weeks ago, on the 26th of August, it was reported that the New Zealand's Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, is planning to pass laws by the end of this year to reverse a ban on offshore oil and gas exploitation that has been in place since 2018. That will pave the way for the offshore mining of the Maari oil field in the Taranaki region, the largest crude oil field in New Zealand. The figure on the right shows active oil and gas rigs as the red and black icons you can see there, with current exploration permits shaded in grey and in pink. It will be really hard to explain to future generations why these decisions were made. Justifying the continued exploitation of fossil fuels under the guise of improving energy security is only going to lock in higher levels of global warming that will be impossible to adapt to and only delays the inevitability of decarbonising our economies. And given that carbon capture and storage, or CCS, is being proposed as a silver bullet for reducing emissions around the world, it's worth doing a quick reality check on the state of the industry. The United Nations Environment Programme has said that around 80% of pilot CCS projects over the past 30 years have failed. Currently, operational CCS plants can only offset approximately 0.1% of global carbon emissions each year. That is 0.1% of total global emissions. And even if all CCS facilities planned and underdeveloped worldwide become operational, we're still only talking about offsetting less than 1% of total global emissions. So relying on this speculative, non-existent technology to work is a reckless gamble with our planet's future. And the risks of CCS on land and offshore are significant and are yet to be fully scientifically and technically assessed, let alone comprehensively regulated. So the figure I'm showing you here is taken from the Australian Government's Future Gas Strategy report, showing the potential suitability of Australia's landscape as a carbon storage or dumping sites. The green area in the east is the Great Artesian Basin. It's Australia's largest source of groundwater, which is a vital resource in an arid country. The permanent risks to farming, Indigenous communities, our landscape and our ecosystems will be profound. And as a scientist, I just can't understand how embarking on such a risky path for such little gain makes any sense whatsoever. The environmental and societal risks of relying on CCS to materialise are completely unacceptable, especially when safer alternatives already exist. Australia is the sunniest continent on the planet, and yet less than 15% of our electricity comes from solar. This tells you everything you need to know about what is getting in the way of the world collectively achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. Despite solar being the cheapest and cleanest form of energy which can be deployed at scale in a handful of years, the Australian Government is still failing to genuinely remove the barriers to the clean energy transition. They are continuing to invest in fossil fuel production or proposing dangerous and expensive nuclear power, which simply diverts investment away from renewable energy and reinforces the reliance on fossil fuel infrastructure for decades to come. And just as a reminder, the world needs a 43% reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And the global stocktake conducted at COP28 revealed that current policies are on track to reduce emissions by just 2%, not the 43% that is needed by 2030. And even if all net zero policies are fully implemented, we will only see around 5% reduction instead of the 43% that the science says we need. So in other words, under a best case scenario, collectively we are on track to reduce emissions globally by only around 10% of what the science says is needed by 2030. It is a policy failure of colossal proportions. And the worst thing about this whole situation is that people do not seem to understand that it is possible to reduce emissions between 50 to 80% by 2030 using technologies that are available right now. This figure is taken from the IPCC's synthesis report, which shows that there are solutions available today across all sectors of the economy that could at least halve emissions by 2030. And the International Energy Agency's net zero roadmap is even more optimistic, suggesting technologies available today could deliver more than 80% of the emissions reductions needed by 2030. And in Australia, the CSIRO has shown that even a fossil fuel intensive nation like Australia could halve its emissions by 2030 using existing technology. They identify decarbonisation of the electricity sector as the way to unlock Australia's clean energy transition. So the take-home message here is that all the solutions we need already exist. It's the political will and the leadership that is missing. So, as someone who has been studying, researching and teaching climate science for close to 30 years, it's now clear to me that climate change is not just a scientific problem, it is the great moral challenge of our time. And as Martin Luther King Jr. said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. And I'm sure everyone in this room knows exactly what I mean by this. What we do during the 2020s will make or break humanity's ability to live safely on this planet. We only have one chance to get this right. There are already irreversible changes in the climate system that will be with us for thousands of years. We have run out of time for excuses. The challenge right now is to minimise further damage. We need true leadership and vision to do what we know is right. And this means no more greenwashing, no more weasel words, just a genuine commitment to shutting down the fossil fuel industry so we can stabilise the Earth's climate as soon as is humanly possible. Because if we destabilise the ice sheets, it will be impossible to adapt, especially in an arid country like Australia, where most of the population lives on the coast or in low-lying areas of the Pacific. We can't reverse engineer our way out of the problem using carbon capture and storage. It will only lead to a delay of the genuine decarbonisation work that needs to be done. Our leaders need to put a price on carbon and accelerate the clean energy transition. And when the benefits of a green economy start to be realised, we won't look back. Our only regret will be that we didn't start any sooner. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joëlle. Thank you. We have time, thank you for your generosity, for a couple of questions. If, as you say, the global governmental response is inadequate, what alternative do you propose to the UN and the Paris Agreement?
Well, to be honest, I don't see it as a failure of what's happening at the UN level. I see it's what the failure really is occurring as what's happening at the national level. I used the example of Australia as a major fossil fuel producer, and obviously I know the policy of our country best, but it just goes to show that its priorities. As I mentioned, Australia is the sunniest continent on the planet, and yet only 15%, 1/5, of our electricity comes from solar. Now that is basically a matter of priorities. And here in New Zealand, as I said, it was really disappointing to read just before I came over to see this rolling back of the oil exploration here in this country. So it really comes back down to ideas of priorities, because I would imagine somewhere like New Zealand could be a poster child for wind energy. And I'm sure there are people here in the room who have more expertise on that. But as an outsider's perspective, it seems basically that we need to be making decisions that really make the case, the economic case, but also the moral case. I think this is getting lost. I was actually quite moved to tears watching the Welcome to Country. We understand what we need to do, and we're not doing it. And I guess as a scientist, having worked at that UN level with the IPCC report, it became intolerable for me to just sit on my hands and not really say the difficult things that need to be said. And that's why I'm here today, but it's also probably why you're here today, because the situation is really urgent. It couldn't be more urgent.
One more question, if you would, Joëlle. This question, someone emphasising the new government's view that fossil fuel emissions perhaps matter less if enough trees get planted to compensate to reach net zero. It's their interpretation, certainly, of policy. But what does the science say?
Yeah, I think I showed you that right at the start, that basically 82% of emissions are from the burning of fossil fuels. Can you see that? No, maybe if we can go back to my slides. Only 18% of emissions come from the land sector. So while I am completely supportive of conservation measures, and obviously it's definitely a part of the solution, unfortunately that sector is being used in a range of greenwashing contexts in terms of getting people to feel good about reducing emissions. But as I said, if we can get my slides back up, the vast majority of emissions are coming from the burning of fossil fuels.
Slide 18 it is, if we can get that up, slide 18. And one more to finish. You know, it's sobering, and believe me, the data, your detailed data is sobering for everybody. how can we give people hope to take action and not stick their heads in the sand? How do you come at this from a human perspective?
Well, I think in the second to last slide, I showed that all the solutions that we need already exist. And I guess as business leaders or scientific leaders or community leaders, we have to take the right approach here and do what we know is right. I mean, it's very clear from the scientific case what we need to do. There's just a lot of political barriers getting in the way. And so I feel that once we get better at painting a picture of what a thriving green economy looks like, the rest of the community will come with, because it's often, when it comes to social change, it really takes about 20% of the population to lead, and then the rest follows. And there's studies I read that I quote in my last book on that. So I believe that change is possible. I'm very worried about what's happening in the climate system, as I showed you those first few slides of this talk. That's really what has compelled me to sort of put my own research aside and come out and address groups like yours and others. I've had the opportunity to speak to the Australian government as well in a briefing, but I guess it's like all the evidence we need in terms of understanding what the problem is and what the solutions are, they're there. There's no ambiguity around that, make no mistake. We don't need any more extra information. What we actually need at this point is true leadership.
Thank you again. Audience, please thank Joëlle.